Welcome to another episode of Mid-Season Evaluation, ladies and gentlemen. In this installment, I'll be giving a review and my honest opinion on how the Hangzhou Spark and Philadelphia Fusion have performed through the first half of the 2019 Overwatch League season. Since the Spark are lower in the overall standings, they're up first. After 14 games, the Hangzhou Spark are 8-6 with a -5 map differential, which is good enough for 8th place in the league. I must say that this is a pretty good position to be in, especially for a first-year team. But before we dive into their performances in stages 1 and 2, let's take a look at how the Spark got here in the first place. Coming into their first year as an Overwatch League franchise, the Hangzhou Spark decided to create a very interesting roster. To start, they signed players from the Overwatch Contenders Korea team X6 Gaming as their core. Almost all of the Spark's roster consisted of Korean talent, but the team also decided to go out and sign 2-star Chinese players in Guxue and Crystal. At the time, I really couldn't understand the point of these signings. Why add 2 players who speak a completely different language? Now if you wanted to incorporate Guxue and Crystal into your game plan, then the 2 of them would have to learn Korean, or the entire team would have to communicate in English. Either way, communication would more than likely be difficult at the start of the year. I really didn't know what to think of this roster. I had a hard time judging how good they'd be. Experts in the Overwatch League, on the other hand, seemed very certain that the Spark would dominate. A few of them even predicted that Hangzhou would win the Pacific Division and maybe even make it into the Final Four of the overall playoffs. I, for one, wasn't sold on them just yet. But the experts and fans both seemed to have expectations that were pretty high. There was a lot of hype surrounding this team, so I knew I had to pay close attention to see why exactly. Test number 1 for this hyped up squad would be the LA Valiant, who at the time were still seen as a threat after how good they were in Season 1. And the Spark proved that maybe they were for real after all by clutching out a hard-fought 5-map set against them. Because they defeated the Shanghai Dragons one day earlier, the Spark kicked off their first week of being an Overwatch League expansion team by going 2-0. What I found very interesting about these matches is how the Spark found themselves alternating between Nosmite and Guxue. It was obvious that Guxue was the better player, but because his Korean was still not good enough at the time, the team was forced to also have Nosmite in the rotation for the purpose of communication and shot calling. Swapping between 2 different main tanks is something I am not a very big fan of. Sure, we've seen teams like the NYXL succeed doing this, but I believe that swapping between 2 different main tanks is a bad idea on a game-to-game basis. Each main tank player has his own style when it comes to shot calling and aggression, so it could be confusing or even difficult for the team as a whole to keep up with the 2 different kinds of players being used in the same game. For now, it wasn't that big of a deal since the Spark were winning, but this will become an issue later down the line, as you're about to find out. But anyway, at this point the team was starting to catch my attention, and I was starting to believe that maybe the experts were actually right about these guys. Perhaps they were a major threat to the rest of the league after all. If they played well for the rest of the stage, then I would be fully convinced. Strangely enough though, the Spark failed to keep up this level of play coming into week 2. They got beat up pretty bad by the Outlaws and a struggling London team as they went on to lose both of those games 3-1. After losing a 3rd game in a row to the Shock, my concerns for this team were finally starting to surface. It was clear that this team looked unorganized, and I think part of the reason for this has to do with their main tank situation. Nosmite was not good enough, and Guxue still brought a language barrier issue with him when he played in the game. Eventually, the Spark decided to roll with Guxue full-time on main tank, and this was probably the best idea for the long run because as soon as Guxue felt more comfortable communicating, the Spark could potentially make some noticeable improvements, and we saw more of what this team was capable of when they smacked the Gladiators 3-1 to end their losing streak. Now it all came down to the Spark's final game. If they even wanted to have a small chance of making playoffs, then they would have to beat the Toronto Defiant, which they failed miserably to do, by the way, by losing 3-0. The Spark lost 4 of their last 5 games as they went on to finish stage 1 at 3-4. The Spark were a little disappointing for me personally. Losing 4 of your last 5 is not a very good look. But things could have been a lot worse, believe it or not. 3-4 wasn't a horrible position to be in, and with there still being 21 games left, the Spark still had plenty of time to turn things around. After making no changes during their 1-week break, the Spark were set to take on the Stage 1 champion Vancouver Titans, which went about as well as you thought it would as the Spark went on to lose their opening game of Stage 2 4-0. After this beatdown, something miraculous happened. The Spark were starting to win games again. They started by beating the Uprising in week 2, and then the Charge in their following game. After a tough loss to the eventual stage champs in the Shock, the Spark won both of their games during the Dallas homestand weekend. Hangzhou was now 4-2, but their poor map differential put them at a major disadvantage when it came to the playoff race. They had to finish the stage at 5-2, which meant that their playoff hopes would live or die in their week 5 showdown against the Seoul Dynasty. In primetime, when everybody had their eyes on them, the Spark came through for all of their fans by defeating the Dynasty 3-1. One thing I almost forgot to mention, by the way, was the emergence of Crystal. It would seem that he too finally felt comfortable speaking Korean alongside Guxue, so he finally got some playtime. I think that after this game though, it was pretty safe to say that the Spark were no longer the same team from stage 1 after winning a game in the clutch and making the playoffs as a result. Their 5-2 record was good enough for the 7 seed, which meant that their first round opponent would be a resurgent London Spitfire team that was really hot at the time. We all know how dangerous London can be when they get it going. They are easily one of the scariest teams in the league who can beat pretty much anybody. The Spark weren't about to show fear, however. They too had been playing very well as of late, and their issues that plagued them during Stage 1 were practically non-existent at this point. They proved they were no longer the same team by defeating London in dominant fashion. After losing on Oasis, this match was as good as over. Not only did the Spark win the next 3 maps to win the series and advance to the next round, but they did it without even breaking a sweat. The Spitfire failed to capture a single objective on Blizzard World, Hanamura, and Watchpoint Gibraltar. After a dominant victory, Hangzhou's next opponent would be the San Francisco Shock, and that game went about as well as their first one, with the Spark once again losing 4-0. They were completely outclassed, but that's okay. They weren't expected to beat the team who only dropped 3 maps while becoming the Stage 2 champions. This was definitely a stage to be proud of if you're the Spark. Not only did you make it to the stage semifinals, but the team showed much improvement. Gushwei and Crystal's Korean had improved to the point where it wasn't a huge deal anymore, and the team as a whole seemed to look a lot more comfortable in game. It's also worth bringing up that their only 2 losses came against the Titans and the Shock, who are widely regarded as the top 2 teams. The Spark have been pretty up and down so far, but 8-6 is still a decent record, which is the exact reason why I'm giving them a B+ as their midseason grade. Stage 2 showed exactly why others have high hopes for them. A top 4 finish in the stage playoffs is pretty impressive. However, their Stage 1 struggles made me deduct some points off of their grade. Sure, you finished the first half of the year strong, but it's hard for me to overlook going 1-4 in your final 5 games of Stage 1. The Spark certainly have potential at the end of the day though, and I'm excited to see what the future holds for them. They're just barely out of the running for a guaranteed spot in the overall playoffs. I would say that finishing top 6 in the league standings is still more than possible for them. That's basically everything I have to say about the Spark, so next up is the Philadelphia Fusion, and they too find themselves sitting at 8-6, but their stronger map differential puts them ahead of the Spark. The Fusion are in a pretty interesting spot. I'm kind of disappointed in them for not playing slightly better, but at the same time, I'm not all that surprised to see them in 7th place. I'll explain why later. For now, let's take a look at how 2019 has gone for the Fusion, starting with their offseason. After a fairly successful inaugural season where they just fell short of winning it all in the grand finals, the Fusion decided to make some changes. They started by saying their goodbyes to Hotba, who would sign with the Guangzhou Charge, and Shadowburn, who went to play for the Eternal. The Fusion also released any other player who was riding the bench, with the exception of Snillo, who would become a 2-way player for them. The Fusion rounded out their offseason by giving the main support player Elk from Fusion University a 2-way contract as well. The first game for the Fusion coming into 2019 provided them with a perfect opportunity to dish out some revenge. Opening night of the Overwatch League would kick off with a rematch of last year's grand finals, and the Fusion would prove that things are very different now by getting the better of London in a 3-1 victory. The Fusion followed up on this big win by defeating Dufresne and the Atlanta Reign in the same week to start the year off 2-0. Then the team ran into a few problems, however, when Boombox couldn't play in week 2 due to an illness. Since the team had no backup flex support player, Elk was forced to play Zen for the next week. Not only was he playing on a role he's not comfortable on, he was informed that he would be playing on very short notice, so he only had a few days to practice. Needless to say, the lack of a good Zen player resulted in a rough week for the Fusion. Not only did they lose both of their week 2 games, but one of those losses came against the Florida Mayhem. The Fusion, however, were not about to let a rough week stand in their way of making stage playoffs. Not only did they bounce back with a win against the Justice in week 3, but they would go on to finish stage 1 on a 3-game winning streak. Not only did the Fusion go 5-2, but they also clinched a playoff berth. They even got their first playoff win of the year against the Atlanta Reign in the first round. Their playoff run would come to an end though after running into the Shock in the semifinals, but the Shock were clearly the better GOATS team at the time, so it's not a huge deal. The Fusion did well in stage 1, and I was hoping to see more of this kind of Fusion in the future. They literally only lost 1 game when their team was at full strength, and it came to the stage 1 runner-ups. Maybe. Just maybe, the Fusion had finally fixed their consistency problems that were killing them all of last year for the most part. I think it's safe to say that this was wishful thinking with how Stage 2 went for them. In Week 1 they got a good win against Florida, but they took a hard L to the NYXL 1 game earlier. The week after that was more of the same. They played well against Toronto, but also just came up short in a close battle against London. This win-loss pattern would continue for the rest of the stage as well. Now sitting at 3-3, the Fusion would have to win their final game of the stage against the Shock if they even wanted to be in the running for a playoff spot. And yet again they fell short, resulting in a 3-4 record for Stage 2 with no playoff appearance. It was painfully clear that the Fusion were pretty much still the same team as last year. They could be dangerous when they were hot, but often suffered from being inconsistent. Overall, I feel like the Fusion have been a decent team. They are definitely not one of the top GOATS teams in the league right now, but that's okay. They're still not bad. They look competent at times, but there are some issues that hold them back. Let's start by addressing the most obvious problem, which would be Sato. While he doesn't have a bad Winston or Orisa, his Reinhardt is just dreadful to watch. Let's just call it how it is. He is easily the biggest weakness on his team right now because of it. The eye test and the stats would both suggest that he is practically useless on Rein most of the time. Just look at his death rate. His 6.59 deaths per 10 minutes is second among all main tanks and ranks 5th overall out of everybody in the entire league. If only Carpe would stop refusing to play with Fraggy. His Reinhardt has always been his strong suit after all. While I can't say for certain if this change would make much of a difference, I don't see the harm in at least trying to incorporate him into the starting lineup over Sato. Why not? Is it fair to strictly blame Sato for the Fusion's rollercoaster start? No, of course not. GOATS is a team effort after all. I also think that Carpe and EQO could play a little bit better in particular. I feel like Carpe's Zarya and EQO's Brig have been a little underwhelming at times. They kind of fit right into the theme of being inconsistent. They look good sometimes, but not all the time. Although the Fusion have been a tale of two stages so far, I've decided to give them a B+ as their midseason grade. As mentioned earlier, they had quite the strong stage 1. They went 5-2 and made the second round of the playoffs. And although they struggled in stage 2, I think it's worth mentioning that their schedule was not very kind to them. Having to play the NYXL twice, a much improved London squad, and the eventual stage 2 champs in the Shock is pretty brutal. I can't even blame the Fusion all that much for their struggles. They won the games they were supposed to, but came up short against some of the league's strongest teams. With stage 3 appearing to be a bit lighter, I'm sure the Fusion will put themselves in a good position to once again make playoffs. As mentioned earlier, I have mixed feelings on how Philly has done so far. On one hand, I was expecting them to be a tad more consistent after their playoff run last year, but at the same time, the Fusion have always been like this. After a successful stage 2 in season 1, they proceeded to play very average in the second half of the year, so seeing them struggle at times is something we're kind of used to at this point. But at the same time, I still did kind of have high hopes for the Fusion coming into this year, so seeing them slightly underperform in stage 2 kept me from giving them a better grade. I think I pretty much covered everything I wanted to say about the Fusion, so with that being said, that is going to wrap up this episode of Midseason Evaluation. As always, feel free to let me know what you thought of my review for both of these teams down in the comment section, and make sure to leave your own grades for both of them while you're at it. If you enjoyed this content, then be sure to like and subscribe if you're new to the channel so you can stay up to date with the series. Thank you all so much for watching today's video, and until next time, this is ATP, signing out. Peace.